Hi, everyone. Special thanks to Ryan and the Hockey Minds podcast for having me. My name is Jason Barron. I'm a player development associate with the Erie Otters in the Ontario Hockey League. My role within Erie is within our player development department, as I work with our organization to oversee the development of our goaltending prospects. I also work with our team on a game-to-game basis from an advanced analytics and pre-scout basis, and work with our management team and scouting staff from a U16, U18, and import priority selection. In addition to my work with the Erie Otters, I also work with the Ridley College Prep Hockey Program as the goalie coach for their Prep Boys and Prep Girls hockey programs. Today, I'm going to talk with you about the sequential and purposeful development in goaltending and going through a development model from introduction into the position all the way through to junior, major junior hockey. Without further ado, I'll share my screen and let's get started. Okay, so like I said, today's topic is the importance of sequential and purposeful development in goaltending. And the topic that I'm very passionate about and obviously has a lot of different components. Each one of the areas that we're talking about today, I could probably make a presentation in and of itself, but we'll try our best to touch on as many different things and provide clarity to the development process as we go through the presentation. So starting off, what is player development? And defining player development is something that is tricky because there are different components. There is the technical proficiency, which is the ability to apply technical knowledge and skills required in order to achieve a desired outcome. So it's doing the technical things and applying the technical knowledge that a player, or in this case today, a goaltender, will need to have success. There's also tactical awareness, which is an ability to identify tactics that might arise in a game or a situation and respond appropriately, whether that be an appropriate movement selection, an appropriate save selection, and identifying based on the tactics that we face, what's our best opportunity to have success. And then our third area that we'll talk about is building our evidence file, which is doing things that make the athlete feel good about themselves. Talking about building confidence, gaining experience in order to have confidence in yourself to achieve that desired result. Ideally, in our evidence file, it's situations where we are getting our intended result from the process that we're doing. So proper process equaling the proper result. So talking about the pathway to development. The pathway to development is a universal concept. And although today's presentation will talk specifically to goaltending, the overall concepts remain the same no matter the position. It is a universal concept, and each step along the way, each one of those steps do not work in isolation. We'll start out with our fundamental skills, and we will branch off from there. And just because step one is fundamental skills, those fundamental skills stay with you all the way along from step 2 to step 3. And the pathway is ever evolving. There is no end product per se. We are constantly tweaking and identifying different things that will allow us to have our optimal amount of success. It may change in different scenarios based on as you begin to play with better players. It might change because of, you become at a level where maybe they begin to have pre-scouts and identify things. It may change based on skill gaps and, situations that the athlete may have trouble with from a skill standpoint. And it may also adjust based on what's going on in current competition. Maybe there's an area that the goaltender is struggling with or a player is struggling with in a recent game, and you need to work on that developmentally to help improve that area. When we talk about how development works, I have a graphic here on the right side of the screen, and it's from one of my personal favorite books called Chop Wood, Carry Water by Joshua Medcalf. And it talks about the process to becoming great. And it talks here about what the athlete wants. The athlete wants a steady incline of success in order to reach their goals. And there are going to be highs and lows and peaks and valleys. So oftentimes we talk about how maybe that feels for that athlete, when in reality, it's sequential and it's purposeful. So, maybe they improve and they get to a higher level, and there are some other areas they struggle with. and then they work away at those areas. So you see there is a little kind of maybe plateau or consistency within the level that they're at. And then they go to improve again. And there are going to be times where maybe there's a bump in the road, and then again, creating consistency on that level. That's how the process of development works. There's lots of different things that play into that process that, account for the peaks and valleys within development. So the pathway to development. There is no shortcut in player development. It is a very personalized approach, and that is kind of what we are going through today. The pathway to player development is built on a relationship between coach and athlete that has mutual contribution from both parties. Both the coach and the athlete contribute to the player development process in order to help the athlete achieve his goals, whether that be early on and working with the fundamental skills and talking with the athlete about what they're having trouble with, or whether that be later on and as we're going to talk about with the player development process and understanding what they do well. This whole process all the way along should have mutual contribution from both the coach and the athlete in order to create a situation where there isn't a buy-in needed because both parties are contributing to the overall success. It is also important in this pathway to prioritize the why. Why am I doing this? How is this going to help me achieve long-term success or achieve my goals? Why is this a key component into where I want to go? Those are all very, very important pieces in the pathway to development. So the roadmap to development has a few different areas. And again, these different steps do not work in isolation. As you climb from level to level, you are still, so for example, our fundamental skills, and you begin with young goaltenders and the fundamental skills. And as they get older and you make modifications, you're still working on those fundamental skills. You don't forget about those. Those fundamental skills are with you all the way up from level to level. So none of this works in isolation. So we're going to move from fundamental skills, and then we're going to talk about maybe some of the modifications or changes that need to happen based on their physical and mental ability as they get older and grow stronger and become faster and maybe have a better mental comprehension of the demands of the game. We'll then talk about reading plays and creating patterns within their game. And lastly, we'll talk about building a player identity and tailoring their development to their player identity and talking about building on their strengths and minimizing their deficiencies. So let's get started. So we're going to start off with fundamental skills. The process of development is very similar to building your own house. You need a strong foundation, and your fundamental skills are your foundation. Once you have that strong foundation, you build the framework of long-term success, similar to building a house. You work to develop essential skills, and you look at, number one, how to do the skill properly. Number two, when to use the skill effectively and efficiently. And number three, why these skills help contribute to their success long-term. Those are such key elements to prioritize when you're building the fundamental skills. So from a goalie specific standpoint, fundamental skills include, but are not limited to, our stance, our positioning and angles, our mobility, and our tracking. We will touch on each one of these very briefly, but like I said before, I could probably speak at length to each one of these areas. So we talk about our stance as a goaltender. Our goalie stance is very, very similar to our athletic stance. Our athletic stance and our goalie stance are similar because they prioritize balance, they prioritize power, and they prioritize coordination. That is your foundation to be able to, number one, react, number two, move and get yourself into position. And here we see a goaltender and a baseball shortstop. This very similar stance could be shown as a tennis player. It could be shown as a football player, a lot of different sports, a volleyball player. A lot of these different sports have this foundational athletic stance because as an athlete, balance, power, and coordination is so important to what we do. Our second area is positioning and angles. So positioning and angles allow us to maximize our net coverage. They allow us to identify our positional depth, and maybe if I'm further out or if I'm a little bit deeper in my crease. And that positional depth may change based on a lot of different scenarios, based on a goaltender's age, their size, their ability, their level of mobility, and maybe the situation on the ice, and it maybe if the puck carrier has options. It may change as they get older. So how you teach a 7-year-old that is 4'5" to play their depth is going to be very different than a 16-year-old that's 5'10" than a 20-year-old that's 6'3". Based on their age, it could allow them to have, more strength. And there's lots of different modifications that we get into in that next step. Positioning is so key to maximizing our net coverage and allowing us to have optimal success at filling space. And all of these decisions based on our positioning, our mobility, all of these are made in fractions of seconds. If a goaltender is not in position, they give themselves little to no chance at stopping the puck. Our mobility. If you can't move, you can't play. That's what it comes down to. Gone are the days of the big goaltender who just stands there and fills space. Players have become so much more faster and skilled that mobility is such a key piece to success. You see goaltenders at the National Hockey League level that are very, very big individuals and phenomenal world-class athletes, but that mobility that they learn starts in these fundamental skills in this stage one, and it grows with them as they go from level to level to level within the development process. Mobility is important because you need to be quick and efficient in all directions, in all sequences, whether that be moving from my feet to my feet in a T-push or a shuffle or our C-cuts. Maybe it's from our feet to our knees in situations like a butterfly slide. Maybe it's while we're down and moving from our knees to our knees in our power slides or our knee shuffles. Positioning and mobility is often very closely linked because goaltenders who move the best give themselves the best opportunity to get into position in the fastest and most efficient way with control. Mobile goaltenders can often catch up to a play that they are late or behind and ensure that they are in the proper position. It is one thing to be able to make a save when you are in the proper position, but if you don't have mobility, you may not give yourself an opportunity to be in that position. So these mobility and positioning components are very, very closely linked. Then we talk about tracking, whether that be tracking the puck to our hands or maybe to our feet and working on our stick control as a fundamental skill, or tracking to our body, or maybe our rebound control and puck placement. That doesn't change whether you're 7 or whether you're 37. Maybe it's tracking through our movements and staying visually connected and keeping our eyes on the puck moving from point A to point B in case we may have to make a save on the move. Maybe it's tracking and locating pucks through traffic. If you're a goaltender in your 7, you might have a player in front of you screening. If you're a goaltender in your 27, you may have multiple players in front of you screening. So it's important in these fundamental skills to talk with goaltenders about where to look, how to look, and positioning themselves based on that traffic, making sure maybe they don't get pushed too deep into the net or they don't get limited with how they can move because they're too close to that traffic. There's lots of different components that go into these fundamental skills, and these fundamental skills stay with you as you move up from level to level to level. We talk about our save cycle, which is from Hockey Canada and their program, and that's just putting together these fundamental skills. So we talk about finding the puck, so being eyes first on our movement. We talk about our movement element and the most efficient way to get in a position. Talk about our positioning and making sure we are on angle and we are at the right depth. We talk about the most efficient save and most effective way to make a save for a certain scenario. And we talk about our puck control and our rebounds and our recovery, maybe killing the player, putting the puck to a non-dangerous area, getting a whistle. So for me, the save cycle is a great visual of the basics of putting these fundamental skills together for young athletes to learn how to play the game using these fundamental skills. Our next step is modification based on physical and mental ability. As athletes become older, they begin to go stronger and faster. And because of that, they now have an increase in physical capability. It allows a goaltender to do more. They may become more efficient in their movements and positioning and save selection because maybe they have more speed now or more strength. This is often happens as goaltenders get into the teenage years, and with that greater understanding of their physical capabilities also comes a greater understanding of the mental demands within the position. Goaltenders become smarter and they gain a greater understanding of the mental demands within the position. Maybe it's how to handle a bad goal, or how to handle a bad game, or maybe a bad string of games. The pressures surrounding being the last line of defense, and any puck that goes by is going to end up on the scoreboard. Sometimes, as goalies get older and begin to gain a greater understanding of those pressures, it's our job as coaches to help them with combating maybe those mental demands that they didn't realize when they were younger ages. And lastly, understanding how to best use their physical capabilities. And we'll get into that a little bit later as they get older into higher levels. But understanding what they do well and building on that in order to have success. Lastly, building ancillary skills is key as we get to that step 2 and begin to have modifications based on physical and mental ability. Building ancillary skills could include things like puck handling. I think it's important when kids are very young to, you know, have them get out and maybe stop a puck. But as they get older into these, teenage years and into the, kind of U12, U13 to U18 area, working on our puck handling, you know, making passes, getting the pucks off the ice, being able to put the puck on the glass. We talk about our post play with our VH, our RVH, and our overlap. For our goalie specific guys on the presentation today, they'll know those terms. And those are some terms that come later on in this development model, because when kids are younger, they maybe don't have either the mental or physical ability to implement some of these skills, whether that be physical strength of, being down on my post and pushing off, or, the physical strength to put pucks on the glass. A lot of these ancillary skills come into play in these teenage years as they begin to gain more mental and physical capabilities and understanding of what's going on in the game. When they're younger, it's more focused on our foundational skills. And as they become older, we build these ancillary skills in to hopefully help them as greater assets within their overall game. Our next area that we're going to talk about is reading plays and creating patterns. As you begin to play with better players and players become older, oftentimes for a goaltender, hockey becomes a game of situations rather than merely a game of shots. And hockey IQ and situational awareness are key pieces of this. So, hockey IQ and situational awareness is very similar to how maybe a head coach or an assistant coach might discuss how well a player sees the ice. We are the same as goaltenders. And we talk about our hockey IQ and situational awareness as understanding the best and most efficient movement or save selection based on the scenario and their own personal ability. It might be talking about more so about respecting options now as players get smarter and are able to, make more elite passes under pressure, or little plays that maybe they weren't able to do in younger age groups. And it's creating patterns within the game. When we talk about reading plays and how well a goaltender understands the game, ideally we would like them to have a similar process for similar scenarios. So making a similar save or a similar movement selection for similar situations. So if it's, Maybe it's a situation where it's an entry into the zone and the guy passes early and the goaltender has time to get there on his feet. If we have 5 of those similar plays, they're getting there 5 times on their feet. There are a lot of different elements that go into that situational awareness, but all things equal, on similar scenarios, we would ideally like to have a similar save and movement selection for that scenario. And that talks about how well a goaltender understands the game. That is one of the hardest things to teach as a coach. And how do you develop this? Well, I think number one is you develop it through video, sitting down with a goaltender and discussing maybe their thought process behind a save selection or a movement selection. I find when I do that with athletes, you learn a lot about their thought process and how they are understanding the situation. Maybe it's in a training environment on the ice where you create training situations that leave room for interpretation. So simulated game scenarios, simulated 3-on-2 entries where, maybe they can shoot or pass early or pass to a guy at the net. Situations where players have options, where it's not predictable and the goalie doesn't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen. They have to read and react. So you want to remove the predictability of the drill to increase the goaltender's awareness for having to read and react on the most efficient movement pattern or save selection. So we've talked about now our fundamental skills, which is our foundation and our framework, building that house. From there, we talked about our mobility, our stance, our tracking, our positioning. That is our foundational fundamental skills. We also talked about, as the goaltender got older, using those fundamental skills to create patterns within their game and build their hockey IQ and develop their ability to see the game in slow motion. Our next stage that we're going to talk about as goaltenders get older and, maybe into junior hockey and midget years, is building a player identity. As you get older, a lot of times with goaltenders who are playing high levels and competing to be the best in their age group or the level that they're at, you're often going to track the puck at a somewhat similar level, move at a somewhat similar level, position yourself at a somewhat similar level. So how do you really get that extra edge? How do you become elite? And I think a lot of that comes into play with building our player identities. So what does it mean to build a player identity? We're going to talk a lot today when building a player identity on what do you pride yourself on. Simplicity is key in this process. We're not trying to revolutionize anything. Simplicity is key to success. We want to look at situations where the goaltender's success rate is high, and self-evaluation is key in this process. There's not one way to play the game, and I think you look around at the NHL playoffs and many different goaltenders around the NHL, from Andrei Vasilevsky to UC Saros to Carter Hart to Anton Khudobin. There are lots of goaltenders in the National Hockey League who have success at being one of the most elite goaltenders in the world, but play the game in very different ways. Self-evaluation is key to this process, and our goal is to look at the goaltender and build on their strengths and minimize their deficiencies. Again, this process can be done with players as well. It's taking away maybe the goalie-specific terminology within this, but the overall concepts of priding yourself on things that you have a high success rate on is universal no matter the position. So building a player identity. Your strengths are your differentiators. What makes you elite? What separates you from the competition? And how do we identify these types of things? And a lot of this can be done through video review. And it can be physique based. You look at the NHL and somebody who is 6'5" is going to have a different net coverage than somebody who's 5'11". Could be skill based on those fundamental skills, and maybe some of those fundamental skills you are elite at and you want those to be some of your differentiators. It can be situational based and maybe how well you read the game and see the game in slow motion. Or it could be a combination of multiple of these areas. Building our player identity is done through a process of factual evidence, providing evidence within the game. It is one thing to say that you do something well. It is another thing to provide evidence of you doing it well. How do you identify your strengths and differentiators? You go through film and you identify it based on how frequently this aspect is within your game. So how often do you do that? And what is your rate of success when you do that? You look at what skills impact that rate of success. So maybe some of those skills that are your differentiators have a big impact on this being your area of success. And then you look long term. Am I able to sustain this success in my game long term as I move on to higher levels? Some things that a goaltender maybe got away with at the U16 level or the junior B level, as they step into the OHL and begin to play with stronger, faster, smarter players, maybe they can't still have that within their game because guys are smart enough to see past it. And then there's skill gaps. Maybe there are areas of your game that aren't as good. They are functional, but maybe not your differentiators. And your player identity wants to take into consideration what those skill gaps are and how we can minimize situations where those skill gaps are put to the forefront. Because the more you minimize those skill gaps or continue to develop those skill gaps, the greater chance you are going to have a success. You can't forget about things you aren't good at. You want to continue to develop those as well. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about building a player identity-based training environment. It's also important in building a player identity to look at comparables. Your comparables are based on oftentimes elite athletes with a similar skill set. You want to understand how the comparable athlete uses that particular skill set within their game to have success. You want to understand how this skill set contributes to the comparable athlete's long-term success. So how does that skill set contribute to their long-term success at the level that they're at? And identify maybe how you can best replicate that success within your current game. It's important to note that these similarities are relative to the level the athlete is currently at. If I'm a junior B kid and I am looking at who my goalie comparable is, and I say my goalie comparable is Tuukka Rask, it doesn't mean that I think I'm as good as Tuukka Rask. It means some of the things that I see Tuukka Rask as being his differentiators on what makes him elite within the National Hockey League, I'm trying to do that to be elite at junior B or be elite to get into the OHL. All of these similarities are relative to the level that the athlete is currently at. So we'll give you an example. So this is an example of a player identity of a goaltender. And after going through video with the goaltender on their current game, we identified as this being 3 areas that they prioritize for themselves. They think they are elite from a skating standpoint. So we talk about beating passes on our feet more than any guy in the league that they're at, getting in a position on their feet whenever possible because they are a very good skater, keeping their feet underneath them and being balanced and coordinated in their stance. We talk about those fundamental skills early on within our stance. Keeping our feet underneath us is very key to that success. This goaltender says, based on the video that they put forward, they showed clips where they were explosive and coordinated getting into position. They identify being aggressive and a good use of flow, which might be situations where they can stand their ground or they need more back speed when someone's coming in to deke them. Talk about being eyes first to read plays, identifying where they're going, how much time they have to get there, and based on that, what the most efficient way to get in a position is based on their skating and mobility. This goaltender has a high compete level, has a level of jam and battle within their game. We talk about competing with control, identifying when to be quick and urgent, maybe get across in a push, or maybe when they need to be more desperate and battle and find different unconventional ways to stop the puck because they don't have an opportunity to get there in a controlled manner based on the situation. And lastly, their structure. They play with a lot of structure. They maximize the amount of time they get into position in a controlled manner. They're coordinated and their limbs move together to close up holes and maximize their net coverage. And they rely on their positioning to maximize their net coverage. They're out challenging and they fill a lot of space. So that is what the goaltender themselves, after going through clips and showing evidence of themselves, this is what they pride themselves on in their player identity. So now the next question is player comparables. So who are some goaltenders that you want to try and model your game after? And this process can be done with players as well. Comparable number one that we're going to talk about is Philip Grubauer because of compete level and jam. This goaltender that we were just speaking about has a similar stature, being at 6'1", and how they both approach the puck is very similar. In their stance, they look a little bit similar. They are both creative in finding ways to locate pucks through traffic because by standards of the level that they're at, 6'1", there are many people at that level at 6'1". So maybe they don't have an opportunity that a 6'5" guy may have to look over top. So they might have to look through and find different holes to locate the puck. So being creative and finding ways to locate pucks is huge. They focus on keeping pucks in front of them and putting pucks to non-dangerous areas. And areas that they want to grow their game in order to be more like this person. So athlete A that we just talked about would like to be more patient on their edges, similar to what Philip Grubauer is. They want to rely on that explosiveness, east-west, that we talked about. So by east-west, I mean moving side to side. So that explosiveness moving side to side, rather than backing into their net too soon. And what we talk about is north-south movement. So kind of side to side versus forward-back movement. They want to be more east-west and work on their explosiveness and playing with their explosiveness and their power that they have in their player development profile. Our second comparable is UC Saros. And I always encourage athletes to have more than one comparable because you can talk about many different areas of your game. You may prioritize your skating because of one goaltender, but when you look at that goaltender, when you're just standing in your stance, maybe you don't look like them, and that's okay. You are not looking at necessarily comparables of their entire game, but things that they do really well and pride themselves on in order to have success. So UC Saros was a second comparable because we talk about how fast he is moving laterally on his feet and while down. He's quick and he's explosive. He's a strong skater. He has an ability to move east-west with control and coordination, which ties back into our athletes' attribute that they talked about the structure within their game and playing with that structure. They rely on their positioning to maximize their net coverage. That's a big piece of UC's game. And our athlete A that we talked about also has that within their game. So that was another comparable that they struck when watching game film of UC Saros. Areas that they want to grow their game in order to be more like UC, trusting their ability to get in position on their feet whenever possible, which ties into that skating element of the player development profile, and being aggressive with depth and trusting their ability to get across on east-west plays, which again ties into the player development model. So you can see how these two comparables and the similarities mask what athlete A prided themselves on. And now they can watch both of these comparables and begin to identify how they use those attributes to maximize their success at the level that they are at. It's important to note in this player development model that it's a very positive process. As a coach, it's important to, again, work and build and grow and develop goaltenders deficiencies and areas where maybe they want to improve. But sometimes we focus as coaches too much on what needs to be fixed that we forget to celebrate what we're really good at. And oftentimes it's those things that we need to celebrate that are our differentiators to climb levels as we get older. You always need to work on areas that you need to improve, but I think we need to prioritize and create a positive training environment that really highlights what these athletes do well and how they can use those things that they do well to reach the aspirations that they have for themselves. Next, we're going to talk about creating an identity-based training environment. So now we have our fundamental skills. We made modifications as they got older and became stronger and faster and understood the game more. Then we talked about building a player identity and understanding and celebrating what you do well and growing your deficiencies. And now we're going to talk about how we use that player identity to have sequential and purposeful development. Every level here has been a sequence, and that's the sequential part of it. It's important for it to also be purposeful. Every day you have a plan. It's not flavor of the day. You're always building and growing and developing the athlete's game in order for them to optimize their success. So creating an identity-based training environment discusses training sessions that should include, but are not limited to, maintaining and continually developing those fundamental skills that we talked about early in the presentation. Again, every step does not work in isolation. You are constantly adding to the recipe of success. You want to develop and improve skill gaps or deficiencies within their game or recent performances, maybe something they've struggled on in a recent game that you may have to draw attention to before their next start, or a certain area of their game that they struggle with and they want to grow. And maybe it's not growing it to a level that's going to be one of their most elite talents, but maybe it's growing it to a level that they can effectively use it at the level that they're at. You want to work on simulating game scenarios and reducing predictability and structure within the drill because you want to encourage your goaltender to read and react. Encourage them to read and identify the proper movement skills and save selections based on situations. And through repetition and gaining that understanding, you want to work to build patterns within the movements and save selections in their game. Like we talked about earlier, similar situations, we want to do similar save selections and similar movement patterns for similar situations, which speaks to their understanding of the game or their IQ. And lastly, you want to have elements that build their evidence file. We want, as coaches, to have the athlete feel good about themselves and go into their next competition feeling confident and prepared. So we want to do the things that make the goalie feel good about themselves. We want to build their confidence. Our verbiage and what we use as dialogue, we want to make sure that's really positive. We want to reference past successes and celebrate when they do things well. Our training environment is a key piece of developing their game. And the more positive that environment is, I think the quicker growth you will work to see. Within this, we talk about our comparables. I'm a big believer that goalies learn from goalies. Players learn from players. Athletes learn from athletes, whether that be a goaltender watching maybe his goalie partner and learning something from a goalie partner, or somebody else in the league, or your player comparables like we talked about today. There are lots of different ways to identify player comparables and then implement those differentiators of the player development profile into a training environment that fosters growth and development. And lastly, our key takeaways for today. There is an importance around building a relationship on mutual contribution. You as a coach want to contribute alongside your athlete. They need to be an active contributor in the development process. And that way, it's not necessarily buy-in because they are contributing to that end product. We talk about the areas of technical proficiency with our technique and our structure. We talk about our tactical awareness and identifying what's going on around us as we get older. We talk about our building our evidence file, which is doing things that allow the goaltender to feel good about themselves in order to maximize their success. Confidence is a key piece in the training environment, and no two guys ever have the exact same optimal training environment. I've had guys who fundamental skills, we put in normally with most goaltenders at the start of a development session because it allows them to get warmed up and get a feel for the puck. Some guys also like to finish with that as well because it allows them to build up their confidence and feel good about themselves leaving the day. It's important to communicate with your athlete to identify what is the best way to build that evidence file and make them feel good about themselves and ready to go for their next competition. Understanding that as an athlete, you will evolve mentally and physically, and so does your game. It is important to do the right thing for the player at the right stage in their development. That is the key premise of today. You want to start out with fundamental skills because everything that we do, as long as we play this game, is based around our fundamental skills. And we slowly evolve into different modifications and building our player identity. All of that is sequential and purposeful. But as a coach, it is important that you do the right thing for the player, at the right stage in their development. And there is never an end product to a player identity. You're constantly building and evolving your own personal identity. It is important to identify comparables and set realistic goals to strive for. And that's done through a process of factual evidence and seeing video and showing situations where yourself or your comparable are doing those things. And in closing, it's important to remember that you are always building your own house, whether that be the foundation and the framework, whether that be the ancillary skills, the player identity, whether that be pouring the concrete pad for the base of your house, or whether that be picking out the mailbox for the little details that add the little extra touches to your overall product. You are always building your own house. So I thank you for listening today. I hope that you found this to be beneficial to yourself as a coach. I look forward to watching other presentations throughout this conference and learning from some phenomenal hockey minds and what they have to say about their experiences within the hockey industry. Thank you again to Ryan and the Hockey Minds podcast. This has been a phenomenal resource and a time to grow in professional development, and I can't thank you enough for allowing me to be part of it. Have a great day.